So what is the cultural context framing for ethics of the Bible? And he says this, when we think of the commands of Scripture, sometimes, and he's right, we as evangelicals have looked for the supracultural commands. Perhaps if you remember when we talked about this a little bit in the time of the terms, we talked about this idea, do we look for a kernel inside of a husk? Do we look for the supracultural commands, and those are the ones we really have to obey? And the consensus among evangelical theologians and missiologists was, no, it's the entire Bible that we need to obey. And yet, these commands are embedded in Scripture. How are we to understand them in light of that? They must be understood for what they meant to the people in a specific time and a specific place, before we can begin to understand what they might mean in our time and our place. We can take out of the Psalms the statement, there is no God, by divorcing it from the words that precede it. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. Likewise, we can take out of the New Testament perhaps commands related to behavior by stripping them of their context and giving them new sets of meanings that they weren't intended to have. You can ask yourself when places such as Wheaton College revised their statement of faith. I saw in the Chicago Tribune just in the last week that Moody Bible Institute has now begun to allow their faculty to drink alcoholic beverages. This is a change for Moody, such a change that it makes the news story in the Chicago Tribune. When Wheaton made its change in 2004, it was a story in the Chicago Tribune. Not headlines, but stories in the Chicago. Why? Because it's the idea that these very conservative schools are changing their sets of social values, when all along the schools have been saying these are scriptural values. How is it they're changing their minds? Are they perhaps digging more deeply into Scripture? Are they perhaps recognizing that we've added things to the Scripture that don't really belong on top of it because of our cultural background and heritage, and we need to look more closely at it and say, well, this fits and this doesn't fit? Biblical ethics are contextual, but not relativistic with no absolute. It's not just a matter of that's your opinion, this is my opinion, but they're still deeply contextual. They took place in a certain time and space, and what they mean in a new setting and how they are to be enacted in a new setting is a challenge. Clearly, you can think of significant examples, such as if in a culture, and there's no such thing that exists in any culture, a way to say hello is to bite off somebody's finger. You wouldn't adapt to that as a lot of people would have no hands. They would learn not to say hello very quickly. But you can imagine a situation like this, and clearly we can't engage in that type of behavior. There are places where the lines are more clearly drawn. How about a place where they spit on your chest as a means of greeting? Which does happen in some locations. How are we to handle that? How about a place where you give what we Americans call a dead fish type of handshake? And it was something I had to learn how to do in Swaziland. If you gripped somebody's hand tightly, you were expressing a level of power over that person. And in reality, you had to learn how to extend your hand and just be a dead fish with your hand, and that's what the other person will do. I never, in my 2.5 years, got used to that. Perhaps given me a couple more years, I would have gotten used to it, because that's what happened in Kenya. In Kenya, I served almost 8 years, and the strange things I found there, I got used to, like waiting in line. What's the right way to wait in line? In the North American setting, waiting in line is one at a time, and the line is single file. And you hear this at airports. You see this in movie theaters. You see this in bank teller lines for ATM machines. But in many societies in the world, waiting in line is not construed as a one by one. It's more or less a free-for-all. And it's a case of having good elbows and using them judiciously, but using them firmly, and not getting so much into the game you overdo it. You don't want to break ribs, even though you might have to use the elbow to establish your place in a line. That feels wrong, especially as a missionary. But in some societies, if you wait for your turn, you will be known as the post office person, because you will never be able to leave it, because you will never have a term. Biblical ethics are contextual. All truth is enfleshed in specific language related to specific cultural concerns. The word love as we use it. The ideal in the North American setting to marry because of romantic love is something that's deeply embedded for us, but in many parts of the world, it's not anticipated that somebody between the ages of 16 and 20 will have any clue what they should look for in a mate. And it's the obligation of their parents or their uncles or aunts or other relatives, or perhaps someone who has a reputation of being a good matchmaker, to ensure that they get into a good marriage. And sometimes they marry the person without ever having met them until the wedding day. And they value that, even though it's a scary thing, in part because the system has taught them to trust that their parents don't want to bring them into a marriage that's going to wind up in a divorce. Their parents want them brought into a marriage that's going to be strong and healthy. Sometimes the marriages are more of political or economic benefit for the parents than they are really for the good of the child. That's one of the abuses. But are there no abuses in our concept of romantic love in this society? Certainly there are. So how do we make the Bible our story? We need to see the world through the stories of the Bible. As you've been working through case studies for this course, and you will do some others, one of the things we have you do is go to the Scriptures on the basis of the case and look for examples in the Scriptures. In North America, we tend to train people to go from the Scriptures to life, but the reality is, Adney says, we need to be able to go from life to the Scriptures. That's part of what making the Scriptures our story is. The primary way we learn goodness from the Bible is by immersing ourselves in the Bible, making the Bible the interpretive framework through which we view all of life. That we see it in light of its context, not there is no God. Without a context, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. We do develop doctrines, but we view doctrines as lenses through which we see reality rather than propositions we apply in various contexts. This is where Adney is most helpful and yet most challenging for many evangelicals. Many evangelicals treat doctrine as though it is a mathematical equation. 2 plus 2 equals 4 no matter where you are in the world. What Adney says is, in terms of doctrine, it's not that. It's more like a grammatical rule. And if you're learning another language, you realize that languages have grammar rules, but they also have exceptions. And so he says doctrines can be more like grammatical rules. They are the way things should operate, but they're not mathematical expressions. It raises some interesting challenges for us, doesn't it? It gives us space to see what it means to love our neighbor as ourselves when we're operating in Brazil as opposed to the United States. But it also perhaps can feel like you're unmooring yourself a little bit from the Scriptures. When you say, what does that mean? And that's where the challenge comes in. Adney is not saying going against the Bible, but he's saying don't treat the commands as if though they are mathematical equations or propositions. Treat them as though they are rules in which we see grammatical exceptions. And if you want biblical examples, Rahab telling lies when the spies were hidden is one of those types of biblical examples. And God honored her and honored her by giving her children. And we can see this in the midwives at the time of Egypt as well, too. The midwives lying to the Egyptians about how quickly the Hebrew women gave birth. And God honored them and enabled them to prosper as well, too. So we do see that even as we look through Scripture, we see examples of things don't quite fit our paradigms if we're thinking simply a rigid scientific law, as opposed to our mathematical law, as opposed to a set of grammatical rules that we're to follow. That helps us think differently about making the Bible our story. It gives us a little bit greater fluidity, but it increases the risk as well, too, of people becoming untethered. And that's where we need community. Community that goes back to the text with it. That's why we need to be immersed in the story of the Scriptures rather than simply reading them superficially for what I can get out of it.